move to the third and best session of the conference. We saved the best to the end, and on a session on school-based gun violence prevention, led by renowned scholar Dr. Jaclyn Schildkraut. Dr. Schildkraut is the executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Prior to this appointment, she served as an associate professor of criminal justice at the State University of New York, SUNY, at Oswego. Her research interest includes mass school shootings, school safety, violence prevention, and media effect. She is the co-author or editor of 6 books, including Mass Shootings, Media Myths and Realities, Columbine, 20 Years Later and Beyond, Lessons Learned from Tragedy, and Lockdown Drills, and also connecting research and best practices for school administrators, teachers, and parents. Dr. Schildkraut has published more than 50 book chapters, research articles, policy briefs assessing different facets of school and mass shooting. A nationally recognized expert on mass shooting and school safety, her research is regularly cited by local, national, and international media. It's our great honor to have with us Dr. Jaclyn Schildkraut.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. I very much appreciate the opportunity to join your group today and to share this presentation. Not too much of a lead up, so I hope I don't disappoint being the last. But I'm going to present today on mass shootings in schools, the lessons from tragedy, and opportunities for prevention and response. And I want to start off by saying, we hear a lot in the news about the shootings that do happen, but we really always want to think about prevention as being our goal. And I want to start our presentation here with this saying, it can never happen here. And as somebody who's worked in the school safety space for many years, this is something that I'm constantly faced with over and over. No matter how many tragedies we hear about on the news, everyone seems to think that it can't happen here. And I have to admit that I too was guilty of probably thinking this statement at some point until it did happen here. I actually grew up in the community it was never supposed to happen in. In 2018, we had what went on to be called the United States' most preventable mass shooting in the Parkland, Florida community. And the reason why it was so preventable, and we'll talk about it throughout this presentation, is because there were so many warning signs about what was going to happen that went unnoticed and unheeded. And consequently, unfortunately, 17 members of our community lost their lives, 17 others were injured, and the entire community was forever changed. Now, the reality is that each one of these presentations is very unique, but there still are some similarities. And in thinking about that, one of those similarities is the fact that they are never spontaneous. I won't be able to hear you laugh, but in case you need a late afternoon joke, this is left field, which is not where they come from. And the reason they're not spontaneous is because there's always planning that goes into these events. And that can look anywhere like days to weeks to months to even years in some cases. That planning is conducted to ensure that the shooting comes out the way that the shooters are intending to. We also hear people talk a lot about profiling. Like if we just know what a mass shooter looks like, then we can go out and figure out who they're going to be before they are and stop them. And the reality is that short of the fact that they all use firearms and 95% of them are men, the reality is that there is no profile of mass shooters. There's a lot of variability between their socio-demographic backgrounds. But they do all share a lot of common behaviors. And when we look at these behaviors in this constellation, it really kind of creates the opportunity to put pieces together to realize that a plot is, in progress and ultimately prevent these tragedies. And this idea of common behaviors is something that emerged out of an initiative from the United States Secret Service back in the 1980s with their exceptional case study project. And what they did is they were looking at people who assassinated high value targets like presidents and other diplomats. And so people who were planning to do that, and also people who had carried it out. And so they noticed that there was a lot of common behaviors amongst these individuals. And then in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as we saw a spate of school-based mass shootings that kind of capped off with Columbine in 1999, they applied that same model to school mass violence and realized that we were, again, seeing a lot of these common behaviors. And so this is along what is termed the path to intended violence, which I'm going to walk through with you guys and also give some examples. So the path to intended violence starts out with some type of a grievance. And that grievance can be real, like the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship. If we're talking about students, some sort of catastrophic failure, right? We didn't get into the school we wanted. We didn't get the grade we wanted. We don't think we have a future. Somebody didn't like me. Or it could be perceived. So thinking that you're socially ostracized or feeling persecuted in some way, even if you aren't. And I hesitate to use the word bullying here because we know that there are so many students in the United States who do suffer at the hands of bullies. Who will never go on to commit a mass shooting. In fact, they're much more likely not to do so than to do so. But we also know that that is a buzzword that has been attached to mass shootings as some sort of way to understand why these individuals go out and carry out their attack. But it starts off with some type of stressor or a grievance. And that's something I think that we all can relate to. We all have these things that happen in our lives that make it, kind of feel like a setback. And these individuals will go on to have violent ideation about how they're going to revenge or exact revenge or address that grievance, right? So whereas we may think about, okay, I lost my job, I need to go out and get a new job, this individual might subsequently think, I lost my job, I really want to go kill my manager. And so it's a very different thought process, and they will sit there and fantasize over and over about it. Those fantasies can be incredibly vivid, but at some point they're going to make a decision, and that fantasy is going to shift into reality. And once that decision is made, then we're going to start to see very overt behaviors that if we detect them and we put them all together can really aid in that prevention element that we're looking at. So they're going to plan out these attacks. As I said, these are not spontaneous. They don't wake up on Tuesday morning and say, I have nothing better to do today, so I'm going to shoot up my school. These are people who plan well in advance. In some cases, as we saw with Columbine, they'll plan all the way down to the details of their clothing, where on their person they're going to carry certain weapons, what entrances they might go into the school. So very, very meticulous and detailed planning. And part of that process is they're going to gather information. And in that process, they're going to research other shooters. We've seen this a lot, and I'm going to give some examples from outside of schools just because they're really the ones that are top of mind. But if you look at the shooting that happened in Highland Park in 2022 at the July 4th parade, you had an individual who went to a building and was shooting a downward trajectory onto parade goers. And that was something that we had seen, of course, in 2017 with the Las Vegas shooting at the Route 91 concert. We also saw in that same year, actually a couple months before that, here in New York, out in Buffalo, that the individual who committed the mass shooting at the Tops grocery store was live streaming his shooting. And that was, again, something that was mimicked as a behavior from the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand. So we see that they are not only researching other shooters, but they're also mimicking them. And part of the research process is really an evaluation of what did the people before me do well? And when I say well, I mean in the context of being able to carry out their plan. And then what things did they not do well, right? What are the obstacles that they perceive that they have to overcome from other events to be able to carry out their attack the way that they want to? And then they're going to start engaging in preparedness efforts. So part of that is, of course, acquiring weapons because otherwise they don't have the means to carry out the shooting. And if we think about it from the context of school-based mass shootings, we're often talking about juveniles who are either having access to these firearms in their homes, or they are stealing them, or they are getting them from friends. So we know, for instance, in Columbine, the two perpetrators were not old enough to purchase the guns at the time that they were acquired. 3 of the firearms their friend purchased on their behalf, which is called a straw purchase, at gun shows, and they actually had specifically scouted out private sellers at that gun show that did not do any background checks or identification requirements because their friend didn't want to submit to a background check. The other, one of the other guns that they got, or the last gun they got, was through a coworker. If we look at something like Westside Middle School, which was perpetrated by an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old, they actually stole those firearms from the home of the 13-year-old's grandfather. So, you know, it's something that obviously they're not old enough to go to a firearms store or any type of dealer and get, so they're not so they're not in a position to get them through lawful means. Also acquiring ammunition. And this is one of, I think, the most understudied things in this space. We don't actually really know how anybody's getting their ammunition. Presumably with juveniles, again, they're stealing it from the home. If we look at something like Parkland, they that individual, we don't actually know the full extent of how many rounds he had. The police reports that we FOIA'd from Broward County simply said duffel bags full. So he had duffel bags full of shotgun shells, duffel bags full of AR-15 rounds. We know that the Columbine shooters, even in pre-1999, when the internet was not anywhere near what it is today, they were even ordering ammunition online and having it shipped to local gun stores to pick up. So, you know, we don't have any sort of wide scale assessment of where the ammunition is coming from, how much is being purchased, or the like. And then they often will engage in practicing their plan. And this is to, you know, go through scenarios to think about how do we deal with things like if our gun jams, like what do we do, you know, if we encounter somebody. If we look at, again, the Columbine shooters, they were going out into the woods and shooting bowling pins because bowling pins are the same shape as human bodies. And so there's videos of them on this range shooting these bowling pins and then proclaiming entry exit wounds because they knew that that's what they were going to be doing to people. And then they'll also probe boundaries. And I kind of explain this to people if you've ever seen the original Jurassic Park movie, not the Chris Pratt version, the Sam Neill version. When they first introduce you to the raptors, and Robert Muldoon is talking about, you know, how the raptors would always test the fences to identify the deficiencies or the weaknesses so they could escape. And this is kind of that same principle. When we think about mass shooters, they're trying to figure out how they can best carry out their plan, whether that's defeating security or, you know, what's the clearest pathway to get to where they want to go in a building. They're constantly thinking about probing those boundaries. For students, this looks a little bit different than it would for, let's say, a workplace shooter or a mall shooter or somebody that's going to a movie theater, because they're already really familiar with the ebbs and the flows of the daily patterns of those school buildings, right? They were students 99 out of 100 times. And so they know what security looks like. They know where people prop doors open, for instance. They know where people will be at certain times of the building, or sorry, certain times of the school day. And so for them, probing boundaries looks very different. In the case of the Parkland shooter, his version of probing boundaries was he would bring lunch boxes full of bullets to school and show them around the cafeteria and see if anybody would do anything, which they did not. He also brought knives and decapitated animals to school, and we're showing that around. And he actually did that at multiple schools, and nobody really ever did anything about it. So, you know, he kind of knew, okay, there's not a whole lot of security here. One of the most overt warning signs is leakage. And I use this picture, if we were talking about Parkland, it would be like the Hoover Dam exploding. But leakage occurs when perpetrators share their intentions with other people. So at the point that they're, you know, planning and probing boundaries and gathering weapons and doing all of these things, right, they become so consumed with their plans that they literally can't keep it to themselves. So for those of you who have children, you know, think about when your child has bought you a present or made you a present and they were just so excited about it that they told you what it was before you could ever open it. It's kind of that same level of excitement, only they're thinking about carrying out their attack. And so there's many different ways that leakage can occur. It can be very direct, right? So them saying, I'm going to shoot up my school. If we look at Parkland, he literally was telling everybody who would listen, I'm going to shoot up this school. I'm going to kill everybody in this school. I could kill you and then go over to the school. But you also have more veiled threats, and this is indirect or sort of concealed threats where, they may say something like, I wouldn't go to school tomorrow if I were you, but you can watch the news. Or if you look at something like the Oxford shooting, when he was drawing all of those things on his math homework, which didn't say, I'm going to carry out a school shooting, but it had pictures of bullets and bodies and all sorts of different things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be extremely overt. There's also numerous ways in which these threats can be communicated. So obviously, person to person or verbal communications. We see things in obviously online posts, whether it's photos of guns or pictures of animals that have been mutilated or threats that are being made. Our shooter in Parkland made videos where he said, my name is such and such, and you'll know who I am when I'm on the news. We've seen it in school assignments. So there's many different ways in which these threats emerge and show themselves. And then if they get all the way up to this point, they're now really kind of at that last point where the attack is imminent. They're engaging in final acts. So things like writing suicide letters, creating manifestos. These are individuals who may start to withdraw a lot more from people because, if they don't want to disappoint their family or leave them with any type of shame, they'll kind of distance themselves. They'll give their belongings away. But at this point, if they haven't been interrupted, it's not to say that they won't be, but it's unlikely at this stage that they will. And then, of course, if all of this occurs, they're basically left to carry out their plan. What this all represents is a series of escalating behaviors. The closer we get to the attack, the more overt and the more, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but the more immediate that this threat is becoming. And it's really important that although I've talked to you about this pathway to violence as though it's a very linear model, it's really important to remember that these things don't always happen in a line and they don't happen for a set amount of time. So you can have individuals who skip stages along the pathway. You can have individuals who go in a different order. They could go forward, back, spend more time in one area, less time in another. They can actually be in multiple stages at the same time. So we actually had conducted a total case analysis on the Parkland shooting using those documents I mentioned that we FOIA'd from Broward County, as well as open source records. And, we found that he was kind of almost manically moving through all of these stages back and forth, sometimes very simultaneously. So it's really important to think about it as not being always linear, but rather a constellation of behaviors that sort of occur in concert with one another. And ultimately, what this all provides is opportunities for de-escalation. If we can find people when they are on this pathway to intended violence, then we can effectively intervene and get them off of there. There's some really great research that was done by the National Threat Assessment Center, or NTAC, which is run as part of the U.S. Secret Service. And so they looked at school-based targeted violence. And they use the term targeted violence because they did look at all targeted violence, not just mass shootings, but the majority of the cases that they looked at were actually mass shootings. And when looking at completed shootings, which they looked at 41 attackers, they found that 100% of those individuals had exhibited one or more of those concerning behaviors that I just discussed prior to committing those shootings, or those attacks rather. 83% of those individuals actually made their specific threats or intentions known to others. And 66%, so 2 out of every 3 cases, at least one person knew and did not come forward. They've also conducted studies on averted shootings, and we don't hear as much about averted shootings because they don't happen. But averted shootings basically occur when somebody with information comes forward, and then there can be an intervention and subsequently a prevention of the attack. And so looking at the 67 attackers that they studied, again, this was an NTAC study, 94% of them shared their intentions with others. 43% of those cases, at least one person knew and did not come forward. And, you know, I think we underestimate how many people are actually aware of an impending threat before it happens. If we look back to the 2005 shooting at Red Lake, Minnesota, Red Lake High School in Red Lake, Minnesota, there was actually upwards of 40 people who knew about his threats and did not come forward and say anything. Certainly, we know from Parkland that there was actually almost 36 people, at least that we're aware of, who had information. The majority of those individuals did not come forward. Somebody did and actually came all the way to the FBI, but unfortunately, the tip was never forwarded to the field office and it wasn't followed up on. When we think about who's most likely to know in a school setting, it's always going to be students, and that's usually because of volume, right? We know that there are far more students than there are educators. And so it's really important to encourage reporting, which is kind of almost the antithesis of what students hear, because a lot of times there's sort of this unspoken mantra of snitches get stitches and, you know, don't tell and don't tattle and all of those things. But it's really important to kind of break down that stigma of coming forward with information, not only to help prevent mass violence, but we also know that youth-based suicide is a concern. There may be violence at home that people are dealing with that they may need resources. So ensuring that people know it's okay to come forward when they have a peer of concern who might need help, that's something that we can certainly do to help across the board. And so that, of course, is, you know, kind of going back to the old mantra of see something, say something. But it's also important that when people are doing that, that we also are, number one, giving them outlets in which they are comfortable in reporting. So one of the ways that we're seeing schools do this is through anonymous tip lines. So these are systems that are usually integrated into school websites. There are apps. They're anonymous, usually with two-way communication. So students can report a tip, they can upload pictures or conversations, you know, like screenshots of conversations, things that they think are concerning, and it'll get routed to the appropriate people. And subsequently, you now have a tracking mechanism. One of the challenges that we see of these systems is that so many schools have them, but they're not really educating students or even staff on how these systems should be used. So if we want to really ensure that we're working towards prevention or we're utilizing systems to their fullest capabilities, we have to be training on those systems. But it's also important, in addition to see something, say something, that we then do something. And again, as I noted with Parkland, there was somebody who came forward. There was actually somebody who also came forward at the school level prior to any of this happening, when he engaged in a failed suicide attempt. And there just was very poor follow-up. And so what we end up running into is that people fall through the cracks, and then things like these shootings happen. As I mentioned, you know, there's sort of this don't ask, don't tell culture, and that's really important to change. And part of that is really starting with the school itself and making sure that schools have a threat assessment team that is multidisciplinary, that is adequately trained to be able to conduct a threat assessment. When we think about it being multidisciplinary, of course, you want to have representation from mental health. You want to have administrators, you want to have security personnel, but also recognizing that sometimes the threat is going to be too great for what your school team can handle. And so then understanding and having a plan in place for utilizing community-based resources, whether your community also has threat assessment team. So usually you'll think about it as your school level being a level 1 team and a community team being a level 2 team, or having just a list of what are the resources or who would we need to call, whether it's, CPS or community mental health, or getting in touch with the local law enforcement department. Whose help are we going to need if we have a credible threat? And this is beyond what we're capable of dealing with. The important thing is that we really all have to work together. And too often we see that the information that we know could help us prevent these tragedies from occurring often exists in silos, and people just are not putting this information together. I think there's no more timely or egregious example of this than the Oxford shooting, when a teacher did see the drawings that he was making and called it in to the administration, who called this individual's parents into the school. And those parents knew full well he had access to a gun and never said anything. Nobody checked his backpack. Nobody did anything. And he had the gun in that backpack the whole time this meeting was taking place. So, it's really important that we're sharing all information and encouraging communication, but also thinking about what questions do you feel that you're going to need to ask if you were to find yourself in a same situation as those administrators in Oxford. Does your child have access to a firearm? Is there any reason to be concerned that he or she would have access? Things of that nature. And certainly not sending kids back into a building when there's a credible threat without making sure that they don't have any instrumentality on them. Prevention, of course, is possible, and it should always be our goal. Unfortunately, response just sometimes may be our reality. And I know that that's not something that we want to ever have to think about. But unfortunately, what we see time and time again is this is just the world. I don't want to say the world we live in forever, but it's at least the world we're living in right now, because shootings continue to happen. I just actually received a call prior to this presentation from a news station in Wisconsin that a middle schooler had a gun and was coming into the school to kill other students, and unfortunately for that student was killed by law enforcement. So, of course, we won't necessarily hear about that outside of that area because it didn't happen, but it doesn't mean that there's not still plans that are occurring or that are about to occur. So that requires us to really think about what our plan is should we ever be faced with the very worst day. And this is where we've seen the introduction of lockdown drills. And today, 98% of schools across the United States, and when I say schools, I should clarify public schools, because that's all we have records on. 98% of public schools in the United States practice at least one lockdown drill every single year. And we saw that the use of these practices really increased post-Columbine. And what was particularly interesting is that on the day of the shooting back in 1999, Columbine did not have a formalized lockdown procedure or active shooter procedure in place. And what happened was, and it's a very, very small footnote in the Columbine Review Commission report, but effectively, when the shooting started outside of the building, everybody inside sort of figured it out. So a lot of people, hundreds of people, were actually locked down in that school building. And so everybody who was injured or killed that day was outside of the building or in the library, which could not be secured, or there was one teacher, Dave Sanders, who was shot and killed in a hallway. But if you look at a very, very small footnote in the Columbine Review Commission report, they actually credit the procedure of lockdowns with saving countless lives that day. Because even though the shooters had what by all standards would be an unprecedented 50 minutes, with the exception of Uvalde, which was 77, most shootings are over in about 5 minutes or less. There's two shooters who had 4 guns, 100 improvised explosive devices, so pipe bombs, Molotov cocktails, things of that nature, and full control of this school for 50 minutes, and they never once tried to breach a locked door. And so after Columbine, we started to see more and more of these, more and more schools adopting these kinds of procedures. But the precedent for lockdown drills actually dates back a lot further. So if we look to the 1950s and the 1960s, when there was kind of concern over the Soviet Union and the Cold War, schools would be like in session, and then teachers would randomly yell drop, and students would have to drop, get under their desks, and cover their heads, under the guise that if somebody dropped a nuclear weapon, that would protect everybody involved. Certainly we know that isn't the case, but the drop drills of the 1950s and 1960s, and then moving into the 1970s in Southern California with the drive-by drills. So you would have, again, sort of the same principle, drop, and then everybody would get on their stomachs on the floor, under the perception that if there was a drive-by shooting near the school, as long as you were lower than the bullet was traveling, you wouldn't get hurt. So we're seeing this evolution about what is the, sort of immediate threat of the moment. And so I kind of want to walk through briefly arguments for and against lockdown drills. And I will kind of go ahead with the disclaimer that I am an unapologetic supporter of lockdown drills, because when they are conducted in a trauma-informed manner, as I'll show you here in a little bit, they produce numerous, positive outcomes. And we also know that lockdowns save lives, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But starting with arguments against, these are things that we typically hear sort of in this discussion that we've found ourselves in for the last 6 years. We get taught a lot, told a lot that we're teaching kids to be sitting ducks. And that's a really challenging statement to kind of overcome, because the reality is that they are sitting there. But we also know that the door lock is the #1 life-saving device in an active shooter event. There's only been 4 cases, including Uvalde, which is a little bit of a different case, but 4 cases in which anyone has been killed behind a locked door. And in 0 of those cases was it because the door lock itself failed. And so what we're trying to do by having students engage in a lockdown procedure during a shooting is to build distance between them and the threat. So it's not that we're telling them go sit in the corner and pray, which is something that somebody has literally said to me. It's that we're teaching them to build that distance between them and the threat themselves. We're also hear a lot that we are teaching shooters, and considering that the majority of mass shooters in schools are current or former students, this is certainly a valid complaint. However, there's sort of 2 things to think about in that space. The first is that it's very unlikely, even if a shooter knew the plan, it's very unlikely that they would have the time to defeat it before law enforcement was able to arrive on scene and bring the event to a conclusion. The second consideration is simply a cost-benefit analysis. Yes, we can risk teaching one shooter, but if you think about how many people are in a school, the numbers of how many people we're going to keep safe certainly outweigh the possibility of the potential to teach one person the plan. At last count, we actually just looked this up for a grant application. The average school enrollment, of course, it's obviously much lower for some and much higher for others, but the average school enrollment is 555 students. So at that point, we're thinking about, balancing the need to not give one person information with the need to keep 554 safe. And so, as I've told students who have asked me this very same thing, I would rather risk teaching them that information to keep all of the other individuals in that building safe and protected. And we also get told a lot that drills are causing psychological harm. And certainly this is a valid concern, given that we have seen very horrendous drills make the news. You may have seen news stories about there was teachers in Indiana who were shot with pellet guns by law enforcement that was involved in the drill. We have seen stories about children who have been exposed to crisis actors covered in fake blood, fake shooters, sounds of simulated gunfire. There was a story out of California earlier this year where the principal literally went around to students and pointed her finger at them in the shape of a gun and said, "Bang, you're dead." So, certainly those types of drills absolutely would cause psychological harm. But we also don't set our schools on fire to practice a fire drill. So there's no need to simulate an active shooter drill or an active shooter situation to practice, excuse me, a lockdown drill. The goal of any drill is to build muscle memory. So that way, if your body is, or your mind is compromised in stressful situations like a shooting, right? You've got a lot of sensation going on around you, lots of sights and sounds, and your anxiety is up, and rightfully so, that when your mind stops working, your body sort of takes over and goes on autopilot. And unfortunately, when we think about these different drills that have been used, they tend to be drills that use options-based protocols, things like run, hide, fight, or the Alice protocol. They're not using things that are more standardized, and they're not being, there's really no tracking mechanism for how, let me rephrase that. When we look at the studies that claim that psychological harm is being done to students, there's a lot of methodological issues with those studies. There's one study that was conducted by a very prominent gun control organization, with researchers at a university, that found that based on Twitter posts that community members were more susceptible to psychological harm, and they were having PTSD and all of these things and anxiety, and the drills were harming people based on these tweets. But the challenge is that you can't say that drills are harming children when children are not likely to be on Twitter, right? Their research shows that they're more likely to be on Snapchat and YouTube and Instagram and TikTok. And so if you're capturing a different group and then saying that it's harming children, that's not really a fair assessment. But a bigger issue is that the majority of studies that are claiming some sort of psychological harm or adverse impact are only asking about perceptions at a single point in time and then saying, oh, yep, this is how it always is. If you actually want to be able to actually measure whether or not something is causing harm, you have to measure before and after an actual practice. And so really, there's been very few studies, our studies and then two others, that have actually done that. And all of our studies show positive outcomes when you are doing it in the context of an actual practice and when you're using trauma-informed principles, which I'll talk about. To give you some arguments for why drills are important, it's always important to practice a plan. As I said, muscle memory is incredibly important, and people need to know what to do in certain situations. One thing I think that's also really important is that we recognize that lockdown procedures or this training that we're doing in schools does not only have utility in schools. For instance, the school district that I worked in is an urban inner city school district that was very unlikely to ever have a parkland, but these were children who were exposed to gun violence in their community. And so I had a lot of different conversations with them about what it would look like to take what they were learning in school and move it outside, and how they could help keep their family safe, because that was their concern. We can also look at something like the Buffalo shooting in 2022, which happened in a supermarket. And there was a really interesting story about an 8-year-old girl who was there with her grandfather. And when the shooting started, her grandfather had no idea what to do. And she did, because of her training at school. And so she was able to get him out to safety versus him getting her out to safety. So very important to always practice those plans. And it also helps to improve preparedness. And I think one thing that's really, really important is to think about when we're talking about lockdowns versus active shooter drills. Lockdowns are something that could be used for any threat inside of the building. I know that, the Melissa Institute is in South Florida. I grew up in South Florida. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School is not that far from the Everglades. It's not inconceivable that something that shouldn't be in a school could get into a school. Also, other areas have different wildlife that should not be in a school. You don't want a student engaging with an alligator or a moose any more than you want them engaging with an angry parent or a shooter or anything else. Excuse me. So when we think about broadening the scope of just emergency preparedness, excuse me, for anything occurring in the school, it's incredibly important, and it helps to reframe that discussion. And we also know that lockdown drills save lives. As I mentioned, there are only 4 shootings in which anybody has been killed behind a locked door. And in 0 of those instances, was it because the door lock failed? But we also have conducted research to try and understand how much of a life-saving effect or protective effect these procedures have. And what we found is that when a lockdown procedure is successfully deployed in a real world mass shooting, it helps to reduce on-scene fatalities and deaths, as well as deaths or casualties overall, between 60 and 80% in schools. So if we can increase the likelihood of survivability by 60 to 80% just by locking the door and moving out of the way, then that just should not be controversial. A challenge for this discussion is that there are so many different options out there. You have run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend, craze, which is civilian response to active shooter events, the standard response protocol. There's one now called hero, which we should not be telling children to be heroes in mass shooting events. But there's all of these different options out there, and they tend to be talked about in this very blanketed way under this umbrella of active shooter drills, which there is no real thing as an active shooter drill, right? There's different practices using different protocols. But the other challenge is that there's so little research. When I started my work back in 2018, there was only 2 other studies before mine that had done anything in the context of an actual lockdown drill. So it's really important to kind of understand that background. And so we have 98% of schools doing something without really knowing whether or not it's going to work. So this is where I came in, and I partnered for safety with Syracuse City School District, which is New York's 5th largest district. And for context, they have about 30 school buildings ranging from pre-K to 12th grade, with about 20,000 students on average, give or take the year, and 4,300 employees. That's faculty, staff, administration, as well as embedded community partners who are working in the school buildings. And so we really sat down and thought about choosing the right fit. And we ended up with the standard response protocol, which is an all hazards emergency response plan from the I Love You Guys Foundation. And just to kind of really quickly run through the project scope, in our first year, we were really starting with a blank slate. We had 30 buildings that were all doing something different. From the point of the district, we were brought in to standardize everything for them after Parkland and give them training. But for us, we really wanted to also conduct research. So in that first year, we actually did a 6-phase project where we did an initial baseline survey with students grades 6 and higher and all faculty and staff. Then we came in and we did 1 round of lockdown drills. And when I say a round, I mean 1 drill in every school building. And then we did a follow-up survey with those same groups, grade 6 and higher and faculty staff, so that we could capture the effects of that first drill on all of these different outcomes that I'm going to share with you. Then we came in and we did training. This is actually one of our trainings that we did in assembly style sessions with faculty, staff, and students all being trained together. Then we came in and did a second round of lockdown drills with some small modifications that I'll talk about, the main one being the drill call. And then we did a final survey, again, same groups, to now assess the effects of continued lockdown or continued participation in drills, but also what happens when you introduce training. In our second year, we were actually brought in to do reunification with them, set up a reunification plan. We were able to conduct an extra round of lockdown drills as a follow-up to see how everything had maintained from that first year. We actually never got to do our reunification exercises because COVID happened. In our third year, even though COVID was still happening, once the schools came back in on hybrid, we actually, our state never suspended the requirement for them to do 4 lockdown drills every single year. So we came in and modified the drill procedure to be COVID safe, and did 3 more rounds of drills with them. And then in the fourth year, they said, you're so good at running lockdown drills, just do all 4 in all of our schools. So we ran another 124 drills for them in year 4. We also did in year 5, but I don't have that data finalized yet. And we were really focused on answering questions, one of which is perceived safety. So how does this change how students and staff perceive their safety at school and in different parts of school? And what was interesting is we found that students started to feel less safe as the year went on. And that actually does follow research more broadly about students and perceived safety. So we weren't necessarily able to pinpoint the drill specifically, but it did kind of go down over the year. But when we looked at it a little bit further, we actually found that it was their exposure to violence that was more consequential or impacting that safety more than the drills themselves. The drills actually help to offset the negative effects of that of the exposure to violence on their perceived safety. When we looked at faculty and staff, their perceived safety was always high and stayed high. It wasn't really impacted by going through the drills. We also asked them about perceived preparedness, and this was what was really interesting. So preparedness was, I know what to do in each of those 5 situations that we trained them on. And after going through the training and multiple drills, students were significantly more likely to say that they felt more prepared to respond in each of these 5 scenarios. Faculty and staff were as well, but what was interesting is that when you break it out of faculty versus staff, it actually was different. So faculty members who were already regularly practicing lockdown and evacuate, because our state requires 4 lockdown drills and 8 fire drills, they were only significantly more likely to say that they knew what to do in lockout, shelter, and hold, whereas staff members said all 5, because we were regularly observing that during drills, workers like in the cafeteria or custodial, they just ignored the drills and kept doing their job. And so once we train them, then they're like, oh, okay, we know what we're supposed to do. Just a few other findings to share. We asked about fear of harm, so feeling like they were afraid of being hurt at school or on the way to or from school. And you can't actually really tell this because the differences are so small. But after going through the training and both drills, students are significantly less likely to say that they fear harm. In terms of perceived risk, so I think a shooting can happen at my school. Again, very small differences, but statistically significant. They were less likely to believe that a shooting was going to happen at their school after the training and the drills. We also, in a separate school district, looked at anxiety and well-being, and we actually found that anxiety was lower and well-being, or the absence of anxiety, was higher after going through a trauma-informed drill than before it. And one other thing that I want to just touch upon before we wrap up is about drill effectiveness. So I said muscle memory, being able to complete a procedure. Lockdowns have very concrete steps, the first of which is get the doors locked. And so here we can see, and this is across about, on average, 1,600 occupied rooms district-wide every single round. Their percentage of doors that were locked were high and always pretty much stayed high. There were some disparities between drill 1.1 and 1.2 at the elementary level, because we actually took the administrators out of the drill. So when we came in on the first drill, we said, do what you normally do, which meant all the administrators were running to the doors to try and lock them before we could get there and say, hey, your doors are not locked. But after that first drill, we said, you guys can't do that. That's not how it works in the real world. And so we had them also participate in the drill. And what we found is that the teachers had become so reliant on the administrators to lock their doors, they had moved to the other steps, but they never secured their rooms. So that gave us an opportunity to have something to work on. In terms of having their lights off, which provides an added layer of concealment, you can see here in the very first drill, a little over half of the rooms had it. And by the time we got to the end of year 4, we were at about 98% district-wide. Out of sight, meaning that we couldn't see them or hear them from the hallway, a little over half in drill 1. So again, we have a lot of people making noise, being seen, to about 90%. So 9 out of every 10 rooms, we couldn't see or hear anybody. It usually was that we could hear them, not that we could see them. I will say we have to kind of, with the 3 drills in year 3, temper the expectations that it was somehow really great and then got really bad. That was when they were on hybrid, so there was half as many students to keep quiet, which is why they did really, really well. And this was the one that kept me up at night the most, which was the door knocks. So we would come and we would knock on the door to simulate somebody trying to get in the room. And as you can see in that very first drill, we had more than 1 out of every 3 rooms answer the door. In what you would expect, teachers would come up and answer the door and talk to me. In the really entertaining ones, they would yell through the door, "I can't talk to you. I'm in a lockdown drill." The really terrifying ones were when they would let kids come up and open the door and talk to me. And so that was something that we really wanted to make sure we addressed right away. And as you can see by the very end, we had less than 1% of rooms that were answering the door. And it was usually just, I forgot or I wasn't paying attention. And, again, we want to make sure that people are engaging in situational awareness, but that's a far cry from where we started. And the final thing that we measured is perfect checks. So how many rooms were getting all four steps correctly completed. And when we first began, it was about 1 out of every 4 rooms. And then we were hitting 82% district-wide. So, and usually, again, it was mostly 3 out of 4 steps. So 75% or 100% steps correctly completed. It was very, very rare that you had anything less. It was usually just, I missed something here, I need to tighten up there kind of thing. And all of that really comes from training, but also staying on top of it. So some key takeaways before we shift to the discussion. Prevention is always going to be our goal. And that really starts with us encouraging reporting, making sure that we're following up on all tips that are being promoted by students, as well as faculty, staff, parents, community members. There's a lot of people with information that want to share it, but we have to give them the ways to do it. And I do want to share, I'm actually from 2 communities that have had very high profile mass shootings. In addition to Parkland, I also went to college in Orlando. If there's any UCF fans out there, who we obviously had the Pulse shooting in 2016, and then there was another mass shooting back in 2009 that most people don't even know about. And then now I live 2 hours from the Buffalo shooting and the Binghamton shooting. So, even with all of that surrounding me, I also need to share that this is an incredibly statistically rare phenomenon. It is horrible. It has catastrophic, widespread impacts, but it is very statistically rare in the context of the national crime picture. And so that is not to diminish the importance of preparing for mass shootings, but it's to say that we need to plan and prepare for all threats that a school may face, not just the very worst day. Response, as I mentioned, may be our reality. That requires us to know what our emergency response plan is. And while lockdown may be the preferred plan when you're in a space where you can successfully secure behind a locked or barricaded door, there will be instances in which you need to ask to leave the building, whether you're in an open area like a hallway or you're in some other unsafe space. We need to give people options, but we don't have to encourage them to do things that infringe upon their safety or that defy what would be the first step in keeping them safe. Also, I just encourage you to think about your reunification plans. One thing we hear over and over from survivors or individuals who lose their loved ones in these tragedies is how poorly reunification is done. There are great models out there, such as the standard reunification method from the I Love You Guys Foundation, but whatever plan you use, make sure that you have a plan now and that you're exercising the plan so that when you have to use it, it's going to go a lot smoother and be better for everyone. You have to train everyone. I hear a lot that just train the adults, don't train the kids. The kids are least likely to be a threat to a shooter. The adult is. So the adult is more likely to get taken out first. It is incredibly important that you provide training to everybody in the building who needs it. And the reality is if you're training in a trauma-informed way, you can train all the way down. We trained kids as young as 3 years old. These, I think, are kindergartners or first graders. We trained as young as 3 years old without any consequences to their safety and well-being. And always make sure that you practice with fidelity. It's really important that you take drills seriously, that you use it as an opportunity to identify what is going well and what needs to be worked on, and holding people accountable when they're not doing what they are supposed to do. Use that time to identify deficiencies, implement solutions in future drills, and make sure that you're always assessing the efficacy so that you know what you need to work on, and you also have a track over time to see if those issues have been resolved. That allows you to adjust your plan as needed, and things happen all the time. I had 2 schools hit 100% perfect checks. on every single room, which was amazing. But on the same token, there were still things, even in those situations, we felt that needed to be worked on. Make sure to repair the cracks in your plan now, because you don't want to be trying to do that. Think about what your backup plans are. What if your doors don't have locks and they open outwards? What's plan B? What's plan C? Think those through in tabletops and staff meetings or in conversations. Students actually have a lot of questions, and the ideas and questions that they will share with you actually can help you start to think about those backup plans on your own. And finally, think about relationship building, again, with your community partners, because the last thing you want to be doing is trying to do that in the middle of an emergency. It's just simply not the time. Focus your efforts on what works. School safety and security is a $3 billion a year industry with average annual projected growth year over year. And the reality is that much of those solutions are completely untested. And if you really stop to think about them, they won't actually do what they're telling you that they're going to do. Look at what the evidence shows will be the most successful and invest your money, time, and other resources there. And keep in mind that everybody plays an important role within this space and within your emergency preparedness efforts. Changing mindsets is not impossible. I worked in a school district for 5 years, and I can tell you where we started and where we finished up. But where I'm going to finish today is by sharing the quote that I started with, which is, "It can never happen here." And as you take what I shared with you back to your districts, and I hope I've provided something helpful, I encourage you to think about the mindset change from "it can never happen here" to "it can happen here, even if it's not likely to." These are some references, and I'll be happy to share resources and my contact information. And I just want to thank you so much for your time. And again, thank you to the Melissa Institute for having me join today.